All right, welcome back everyone. So let's see how well you did. So first, remember there's two different types of creativity, divergent and convergent. So when you took the remote associates test, right, the RAT, right, what type of creativity was that measuring? Right, convergent, right, because there was only one right answer, right? But what we're interested in is that divergent creativity, which is what the other two tasks that you had to do were about. So think about those other two tasks and the scoring that we're going to use here, because this is what we're really going to focus on. So I'm going to go over the different parts of creativity in terms of measurement, and on the next slide I'm going to show you some of the responses that I've had from students over the years, so you can kind of see how well you did relative to others. So when we're thinking about creativity, right, can be assessed in four different ways. First of all, the first idea is this idea of fluency, right? Creative people tend to come up with more ideas in general. So look at your responses. How many did you come up with? A handful, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, right? Creative people tend to come up with overall a greater number of responses. The second category is elaboration. So this basically is about detail. Creative people tend to look at things in more detail. So for example, if I said, hey, what can you use a brick for? And you said, oh, a doorstop. Right? That's not really elaborative. You're not really expanding on it and giving a lot of detail, right? A creative person would elaborate a lot. So for example, they would say, hey, you can use a brick as a doorstop to prevent a door from slamming shut in a strong wind, right? Do you see the difference, right? So look at your responses. To what extent do you elaborate? Do you give a lot of detail, right? So you might think, oh, well, I didn't know that I had to elaborate, right? Creative people, right, they would just naturally elaborate and see these details and write them down. Originality, so this is kind of what we think of as creativity, right? You come up with a response that no one else has thought of. So next slide, you can kind of compare your responses to others to see if you came up with something that no one else did, right? That's what originality is about, coming up with something that no one else did. The last part of creativity is flexibility. So this has to do with how different your responses are from one another. So creative people tend to come up with responses that are not really related, right? Whereas people who are not as creative, their responses, if you look at them, they're very closely related. So let's look at some examples, and I'll give you a little bit more detail about how those are related. So on the left here, we have the uses for a newspaper, right? So these were a lot of responses that we got from students over the years, and what we did was we put them into these categories, right? So I know it's a little violent right here, but there was a hitting category, right? So did you say that, hey, newspaper can be, used to hit someone, to kill a bug, to throw at someone, those sorts of things. So if all of your responses were kind of related to being used as a weapon or hit something, right, that would be touching on that last category of flexibility, right? Or did your responses tend to be from different areas? So for example, did you have maybe one example of, hey, you could use it as a weapon, or as another you said, hey, you could use it to sell it for money, right? Those are completely different. So you'd get scored basically that you are very flexible. You think about things in terms of different categories. So other different categories, right? People said you could sell it for money, sit on it in the grass, stuff your bra, interestingly. But look at some of these other responses, particularly this last one. You could use a newspaper to cover tables and floors when painting a picture or when kids do crafts or art projects, right? What does that strike you as scoring high on? Elaboration, right? So, I mean, a simple response would be, hey, you could use it to cover the table, use it as a tablecloth, right? Or use it for, to cover something up on the floor. But look at the detail that they gave, right? When painting a picture, or if a kid's doing a crafts project, right? There's a lot more detail. So this response right here would get a couple different points, right? One for, being very elaborate, score high in elaboration. It's from a different category. So, right, if they had, this answer, this answer, this answer, they're from different categories, right? If no one else had this response, right, they get a point for originality. So you can get overall, how well you're doing. Let's look at the cat and mouse similarities, right? So if you had responses like, hey, they both have two ears, two eyes, a mouth, so on, right? These are really physical attributes. So if you had a lot of these, right, you'd get points for just the fluency, how many ideas you came up with, but you're not touching on a lot of different categories, right? So this, you wouldn't get a lot of points for flexibility if you had said a lot of these responses. But if you had some of these, but then you also had different ideas, right? So for example, you said, hey, they both can't speak English, right, you would get points for having them from different categories. So that would be that flexibility component. Also, this overall would score probably pretty high for originality, right? How many of you had said that, hey, both can't speak English, right? That's something that over the years I've noticed has been kind of a novel, original response. So overall, I want you to kind of look at your responses, knowing the different ways that you can measure creativity, and think to yourself, based off of your responses and knowing how creativity is measured, how creative are you, right? Did you come up with a lot of ideas? Did you elaborate? Are your ideas somewhat related? Are they from different categories? Did you come up with something that no one else had thought of, right? And those will give you a good indication as to how creative you are. So you've taken the test, you're getting a feel for how creative you are. So the next video, the last video we're going to talk about is what you can do to increase your creativity.